Well, welcome to the 9th week of our summer family worship series called One Big Story. Throughout this series, we've been taking a closer look at various scripture passages and characters covering a variety of genres and time periods in the 66 book library we call the Bible. And what we've discovered so far is that this collection of narratives, poetry, letters, prophecy, gospels, and wisdom all work together to communicate one big story. A story of God's unfailing, God's unrelenting, God's unconditional love for us. This profound love that God has for us, combined with God's pursuit to be in relationship with us, is the common thread that's sewn through all of Scripture. And over the last 8 Sundays, we've seen that no matter who you are or what's going on in your life, no matter when you first came to church or how often you come, no matter what your background or how much baggage you're carrying, God has a plan and purpose for your life. You are designed by God. You are fearfully and wonderfully made and deeply loved by your Creator. Whoever you are, you have the ability to make a difference. God can use you no matter what. Your gifts, your skills, your talents, your personality, and your unique set of circumstances are an asset to God and God's eternal story. In fact, this is the underlying premise in today's story from the book of Esther, a snippet of which we just saw. An entire people group is at risk, and Esther finds herself in a position to make a difference. If she can muster up the courage to speak up and speak out against any people and powers perpetrating these hateful acts. The task at hand is not an easy one, and there's a lot at stake for her personally. Watching Esther overcome her fears and make that difficult decision to be brave, then witnessing her follow through with it, hopefully inspires us to want to do the same. Esther encourages us to live like God has a plan for you. That's our bottom line for today. Live like God has a plan for you. And this, I have to say, is easier to do on the days when evidence of God is obvious and God's presence is palpable. Perhaps you've experienced a God prod or two over time, those moments when you can feel God with you and you know that God is in your presence. But what about those times when God's presence is not so obvious? What I like about Esther is that she also models for us how to handle the times when the presence of God feels distant or seemingly hidden from us. And it's in these hidden times, who better to remind us of our God-given strength and abilities than a woman whose name actually means hidden. Although she was named Hadassah at birth, it was later changed to Esther, meaning hidden, and appropriately because throughout the story she is hiding her Jewish identity from the authorities. Also hidden in the story is God. Nowhere in this entire book is God mentioned. It's the only book in the entire 66 book canon that this is the case. Which means we need to ask why. Why is God not mentioned? And whether we like it or not, perhaps it's purposeful. So as we watch this string of coincidences unfold, we tend to see God guiding the way. So why not just come out and say it? Say that God's the one making all of these things come to fruition. Well, the professor of Jewish studies at Harvard Divinity School, John D. Levinson, says this in his commentary on Esther. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. So let's pay attention to these coincidences as we take a closer look at the story. I'm going to tell it again, but with a few more details than the video version that we saw earlier. What they always do for us in Upstreet is they hone it down to be age appropriate. So what our storyteller Brian didn't unveil in his mask swapping was the detailed background of how extensive the Persian kingdom was and how an orphan Jew came to be queen over it. So here's a bit of the background. The setting of the story takes place in Susa, which was the citadel of Persia, and a large population of Jews live there. They've been there about 100 years at this time. It had been about a century since King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army decimated Jerusalem and the temple and carried the exiles back to Babylon. And if you remember, they took the best and the brightest, the professional class, the artists, the skilled professionals. And then, after they got there, a little time went, and King Cyrus of Persia came in and conquered Babylon. And when King Cyrus came to rule, he said that the Jews who wanted could go home. They could go back to Jerusalem, try to rebuild the temple, and have their life there. And some of them took him up on the offer. And you can read those stories in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But others had kind of settled in and gotten acclimated, and so they decided to stay in Babylon, and they're called the diaspora, the Jews who are living outside of Jerusalem. Well, during King Cyrus's reign, he continued to extend the kingdom and extend it, push the boundaries further and further. And then his follower, King Darius, did the same. And so when Darius died, his son, King Xerxes, who's the king in our story today, inherited this massive kingdom. They say it was the largest empire ever at that particular time in history by population and percentages. Michael, could you put that map up? They estimate all the red now is Persia. And they estimate that 50 million people live there, or 44% of the world's population at the time. And so this is important. I know it's a little blurry, but up on the far corner, you can kind of see on the left-hand corner, Athens. That's going to play a part of this story today. Because as King Xerxes becomes ruler, he's at home, and he wants to throw a party for his officials and the military and all of the people in his ranks to give them a taste of all the wealth and power that they had amassed by conquering all this. He wanted to fire them up, too, for their next conquest, which is going to be Greece. So they want to push up and conquer that whole top left-hand corner. And so he decides what better way to give them that taste than to throw a huge party. And by huge, I mean 6 months long. This is a 180-day party where food and drink and everything is flowing. Like it is party pumped up to another level. So after this 6-month-long soiree, King Xerxes decides, how do I follow that party? Perhaps with another party. And so he has a second party that's 7 days long in the garden courtyard. And this party is for all the people of Susa, the rich and the poor alike. Now he's bringing in the common folk for a party, and he shows them the grandeur of the kingdom too. And to end the party, the grand finale, he wants to show off his most prized possession of all, Queen Vashti. So he says, bring the queen in. And she, having a feast of her own with some women in her court, says, no, I'm not going. And this puts Xerxes into a little bit of a situation, right? He's a little nervous, a little humiliated, and his counselors say, we cannot have this. You cannot have your wife showing you up like this. All the wives of the kingdom will think that they can act this way. We have got to put her in her proper place. So they banish her from his presence, and they strip her of the crown. And that's where the story picks up today when they say that he's now ready to find a new queen. And so to find a new queen, they bring in beautiful virgins from the 127 provinces across the land. And they have them have extensive beauty treatments. And again, by extensive, you're going to see a lot of exaggerations in this story. It's months and months of sea salts and scrubs and spa appointments. And to get them all prepared so that they can parade in front of King Xerxes. And our young Jewish orphan, Esther, is one of these contenders. Esther lived in Susa with her uncle Mordecai, who had adopted her after her parents died. And when the king's search became public knowledge, Esther was one of those girls taken before him in the court. But throughout all those treatments that she received, all the beautifications, she never once divulged that she was a Jew. So to make a long story short, the king took a liking to Esther, made her the queen, and then he hosted a banquet called Esther's Banquet and proclaimed it a national holiday, and gifts galore were given out for the occasion. All the while, Uncle Mordecai stayed close out in the palace courtyard so that he could kind of see see and hear what was going on with Esther every chance he could. And one day, while he's there, he hears two of the king's men talking about wanting to kill the king and overthrow him. So he tells Esther, Uncle Mordecai tells Esther tells the king has it investigated, finds it's true, and those two men are hanged. And they have it recorded in the journal that keeps a record of all the daily events happening in the kingdom. And we have now made it to chapter 3 of the book, and this is where we meet our villain, Haman. Dun, dun, dun. Haman is the king's highest-ranking official, and to honor him, as you know, the servants were all supposed to bow down before him. The king had commanded it. Everyone in the kingdom did it, except Mordecai. Well, eventually, the king's servants questioned Mordecai about his disobedience, and he says, "Sorry, I am not going to bow." And so, fed up with his behavior, they report this to Haman to see what can be done about the situation, and then they say, and you know what? Mordecai's a Jew. And this is where Haman gets infuriated. And he decides, for Mordecai's insolence, he is going to have a penalty, not just for him, but for all the Jews. And this is where he decides his plan to eliminate them all from the kingdom. So he tells King Xerxes. King Xerxes says, okay, and he puts the royal signet on it, and it is so. Well, Uncle Mordecai hears about this out in the courtyard, and decrees are put up all over town, and he immediately goes into mourning. And as you know, often in the ancient times, they put on sackcloth and ashes. So he rips off his clothes, and he puts on those sackcloth and ashes, and he is crying and wailing publicly. And throughout the kingdom, all the other Jews began doing the same. Well, news of this makes it to Esther in the palace, and she's stunned by what she hears, not knowing the full story. So she sends her servant Hathach to take Mordecai a clean set of clothes and kind of get the scoop what's going on. Mordecai shares the news with her and even gives her one of the public decrees to prove what the impending action is. And he tells her she needs to implore the king that this mass murder cannot go forward. Well, when Hathach goes and tells Esther all of this, she sent him back to Mordecai saying, "You don't understand. I can get killed going before the king if he hasn't invited me into his presence. Walking in unannounced, that can get you hanged." So Hathach goes back, tells Mordecai what she says, and then this is where we get the famous quote. And I want to put it up today so we can look at it closer. But Mordecai tells her through Hathach, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." And that convinces Esther that her uncle is right. So she rallies the support of her court. She says they all need to fast for 3 days. She asks Uncle Mordecai to have the rest of the Jews in the kingdom do the same. And if everyone will fast, all the Jews, for 3 days, she will go before the king, even if it means he doesn't put his scepter out and she's killed in the process. And so they fast. She goes before the king. As you know, he does extend the scepter, and he says he'll give her anything, up to half the kingdom. And she can pick anything. And she says, "Okay, I'd like you and Haman to come to dinner." And so the king calls Haman. They go to dinner, and again he says, "Esther, what do you want? Up to half of anything in the kingdom will be yours." And she says, "I would like you to come to dinner again tomorrow night. And then at tomorrow's dinner, I promise I will share the desires of my heart." Well, after that dinner, Haman struts haughtily away. He is puffed up. He is feeling good about himself. He was so important. He was the highest ranking official in the government. He rubbed elbows with royalty. He had a place at the table with the most powerful people in the land. Yes, he was on top of the world, and he couldn't wait to brag more about it. But then he passed the city gate, and there's Mordecai, once again, not bowing for him. And all of that went right out the window, and he was hot. He was so mad that Mordecai was so disobedient and had no respect for him that he stomped all the way home. And when he got there, he brought his friends and family together to brag about how rich he was, how powerful he was, how smart he was, how prolific he was, how great he was at everything. He bragged that the king honored him above all others and that the queen invited him to dinner 2 nights in a row. But he admitted to them, I have to tell you, I just can't enjoy much of it with this Mordecai the Jew disrespecting me. Something's got to be done about it. And his wife and his friends said, you are right, and we have the perfect idea. Build a gallows and then have the king hang Mordecai on it. The sooner the better. In fact, how about tonight? Have the gallows built tonight, go to the king first thing in the morning, and have Mordecai hang tomorrow morning. Problem solved. Well, Haman loved this idea, so he ordered it to be so. Meanwhile, across town in the palace, the king can't sleep. So he says to his attendants, bring me the book of daily journal entries so I can see what's been going on in the kingdom. Since I have insomnia, surely that will put me to sleep. So they bring the annals and they start reading, and it so happens, coincidence, that one of the entries they read is about the time that Mordecai saved his life by telling about the plan of the 2 men. And when King Xerxes hears this, he says, well, did we ever do anything about that? Did we reward Mordecai for his actions? And King Xerxes, and they tell him, no, he never got rewarded. Well, about that time, I guess the sun's coming up and the roosters are crowing. King Haman has appeared at the king's door to ask about hanging Mordecai. The king invites him in, and before Haman has a chance to ask his question, the king asks Haman a question. He says, what would be appropriate for the man the king wants to honor? And Haman thinks he's talking about him, right? He was like, oh, I think for a man the king wants to honor, you should put him in your king's robes, put a crown on a royal horse, and parade him through town. And Haman said, yes, that's the perfect plan. And the king said, go and do it now for Mordecai. And Haman is devastated, right? So he has to do this. And so after the end of the night, he sulks home to hide his face. Things are looking bleak for him. Everyone admits it. And the king's men appear and say, it's time for you to go to your dinner at Esther's. So he goes to the dinner at Esther's, and she pours he and the king a glass of wine. And the king asks again, Queen Esther, what can I give you? Up to half of my kingdom. And she says, what I would most like from the king is for you to give me and my people our lives. She revealed her Jewish identity and explained that she and her people were destined to be destroyed, that a countdown to genocide was on. And King Xerxes was furious. Who had done such a thing, he asked. And Esther pointed right across the table and said, Haman. Haman did it. And the king was filled with rage, and he stormed out into the garden to get a breath of fresh air. And while he was out there, Haman starts pleading with Esther. Unfortunately, they picked the couch for the setting of this scene where he's pleading for his life from her. So when the king comes back in and sees the two of them in this precarious position on the couch, he thinks that Haman is doing something indiscreet and orders him killed immediately. And then with Haman out of the picture, a whole bunch of reversals start taking place in the story. First, the king gives Queen Esther Haman's estate. Then he gives Mordecai the royal signet ring. So basically, all of Haman's prized possessions and power were placed in the hands and on the hands of the Jews, the very people that Haman wanted destroyed. And thanks to Esther's pleading with King Xerxes, he reversed his earlier decree to massacre all the Jews in the kingdom, and the people were saved. And news traveled quickly across the land to every province, and they began feasting and giving shouts of joy. And then some more reversals take place in the story. Granted, these are a little harder to digest. One of them is that on the day that all the Jews were scheduled to be killed, the tables were turned, and they instead killed all their enemies in the reversal. And then Mordecai recorded that everything that took place, and he sent the news out to all the regions that they had had their lives spared and the enemies had been crushed. A celebration was in order. And what better way than to have a feast with food and drink and giving gifts to each other and to the poor until our hearts are content. And still today, this celebration continues on an annual basis. It's called the Festival of Purim, and it commemorates Haman's plot to massacre the Jews being overthrown. And it's the most joy-filled of all the Jewish festivals. It's big parties, massive amounts of food and drink. It's kind of Mardi Gras-esque. And one of the well-known foods that's eaten during Purim is called hamantaschen. And they're these little pastries with poppy seed fillings or fruit preserves or chocolate chips. And basically, hamantaschen means Haman's ears. They're triangle. And they're symbolic of Haman's either his hat or his triangular ears. And so, as part of the fun today, after the service, I have ordered some hamantaschen from a bakery in Brooklyn, and you can have some Haman's ears afterwards. But I want you to take the time while you're to reflect. Seriously though, that what evil is going on around you that you might be called to speak up and speak out against? So, also during Purim, the scroll of Esther is read twice during the day, and it's typically done with masks and noisemakers and crowd participation. Every time our heroine or Mordecai's name is mentioned, there's cheering and hoopla, yay! And then every time the villain of the story, Haman, is mentioned, there's booing and hissing, boo, hiss. And before we started, when I was preparing for this, I thought, I'm going to have the kids do that today while we're in to keep them paying attention. And then I realized how many times all those names were said, and I thought it might get a little out of hand. But what I liked is they incorporated that into the video we saw earlier. One of the reasons I'm sure he used all those masks like that is he's playing out part of the foundational history that'll allow us to build that story further when the kids get older. So, anyway, overall, the book of Esther is an entertaining story full of feasts and fanfare, coincidences and chance encounters, exaggerations and reversals, but it is also a story about courageous risk-taking. It's a story about discerning words of wisdom that come your way and heeding the call to action. And it's a story about overcoming feelings of fear and reluctance that might be holding you back, especially when speaking up or taking action feels uncomfortable or scary. And the story also teaches that you never know the power your words or actions might have to right a wrong situation and save someone in the process. Now, of course, it's easy to credit Esther because she had a prominent position and close proximity to power. I'm guessing not many of us are queens with the ear of a king at our disposal. But despite whether we have immediate access to those in power or not, despite whether we have family members willing to guide, nurture, and speak hard truth to us whenever necessary, despite whether we're able to affect significant change for thousands or just one person, and despite whether we acknowledge God's presence and the hints of divine action in our midst, God is still at work in the world, accomplishing extraordinary plans for a kingdom like no other. And God accomplishes these plans by working in us and through us, equipping us each and every step of the way. All you have to do is say yes to God's invitation to play a part. Live like God has a plan for you and be ready to make a difference in ways that only God can imagine. May it be so. Amen. Will you please pray with me? Gracious God, author of life, we give thanks that you meet us in stories. Meet us in this one today. Reveal the truth you have for us and help us discern whether you're calling us to speak up, to speak out, to make a difference in a life or two or three or more. Fill us with your Spirit and give us holy boldness to act. And in the times you seem hidden and we can't feel your presence, remind us of another story of deliverance and salvation and the actions that Christ took for us. We ask this in his name and pray the prayer that he taught us, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.